Education opens doors for the gospel, bringing hope to dark places and sparking lasting change around the world. At Teach Beyond, we're reaching the nations through education.
This is Transformed and Transformational, a podcast from Teach Beyond. I'm Kian.
And I'm Heather. We're exploring how the gospel transforms us and overflows to impact classrooms, communities, and the world.
Let's jump into today's conversation. Today's our first Teacher's Desk of Season 6. Every month, we get to focus on a topic relating to education. And today, our guest is Dr. David I. Smith.
And this conversation is gold. Honestly, Kian, I would have loved to have heard this as a classroom teacher. I'm thinking back to my 5 years in the classroom, and it was my first years of teaching and really just wanted to do this well and care about the students in my classroom and just somehow help them experience the love of Jesus authentically in our time together. And that felt like a massive responsibility. I know a lot of teachers feel that sense of like, this is a big task. So David is so great at providing practical examples that make it feel possible.
It definitely makes it more approachable. David is an author of a number of books focused on Christian teaching and what that can look like, including his latest book, Everyday Christian Teaching, which is what we're going to be talking about today.
David has also been a professor of education at Calvin University in Michigan in the United States for 25 years. But he's originally from the United Kingdom, where he began his teaching career working in public secondary schools teaching French, German, and Russian.
David has a PhD in education with a specialization in curriculum studies in foreign language pedagogy from the University of London. Let's go over to that conversation now. Hi, welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you. Good to be here.
David, we're so glad to be talking to you today about the intersection of faith and teaching. And as a former classroom teacher and one who works with a lot of educators, this is definitely a topic that I've heard a lot about, but you've spent decades exploring this. What would you say first sparked your interest in how faith informs classroom practice?
It was a very existential question for me because I became a Christian as an adult at the start of my undergraduate studies. So when I was 18, and then I spent the next 3.5 years as a Christian student at university, and then got to the end of my studies, and I didn't go to university with a plan. It was like I went to university because they would let me keep studying for 4 more years. And so I got to the end and thought, well, now I've got to go get a job. I've got to do something. So I did a lot of praying around that and taking counsel, and came to the conclusion that I was called to be a teacher. And that was kind of surprising to me because I'd internalized this idea that if you were really sincere about wanting to serve God, you would go be a missionary, right? Or at least a pastor, or at least maybe a youth pastor if you were sort of almost Christian. So I ended up going into teaching. And because I'd been studying languages for years, being a teacher meant I was going to be a language teacher. Like I wasn't even going to be something cool like a Bible teacher. Or at least like English lit, where we could talk about witches in Macbeth or something. So I was going to be teaching French grammar. So right from the start of my teaching career, this question of I've just become a Christian and I've just become a teacher. And being a Christian is supposed to affect everything I do. I mean, it's not like a weekend hobby. And yet being a teacher is where I spend most of my time. And yet being a teacher is teaching languages, right? It's not doing churchy stuff. So just trying to figure out that conundrum out, how do these two things fit together? And then starting to realize pretty quickly in my classroom that some of the things that I was being asked to do in my department through my teaching materials and so on didn't seem to sit really well with what I was learning about being Christian. And just starting to realize this is not just like teaching languages. There are different ways of doing this. My teaching is always telling a story about how the world works. So that was the start of it for me, just trying to practically figure out how do I live through the week with any integrity, trying to balance these two new identities.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I think a lot of us are familiar with the idea of Christian schools, Christian education, where you're Christian and you want to teach Christianly. So you go to a Christian school and you can teach there. But your book is called Everyday Christian Teaching. So what makes that different than teaching at a Christian school?
Well, teaching in a Christian school is no real guarantee of anything because what it can mean is you feel like you've got more freedom to pray at the start of class, or there's a chapel program or whatever. But that, getting a job at a Christian school doesn't instantaneously transform the way you the way you think about how to teach your discipline, or the way you think about how to organize your classroom, or how to manage classroom relationships, and so on. So there's a whole layer of rethinking to go on there, and a lot of us have been, fairly deeply trained in certain ways of thinking about schooling, either because we've worked in schools or just because of what was done to us when we were kids, and because of the books we've read, the movies we've seen, etc. And so becoming intentional about that, I think, is a lifelong project. And in some ways, being in a Christian school, there's almost a temptation with that like, because you pray at the start of class, maybe you don't need to think quite as hard about the other stuff. I found that I taught in K-12 public schools for 6 years at the start of my teaching career, and that was where I was starting to try to figure this stuff out. And I didn't have the freedom of just like praying at the start of class or reading out a Bible verse or something. So I think that was actually part of what drove me to looking much more at the actual teaching and learning process. So just to get concrete, because I love to get concrete as quickly as possible, it hit me at a certain moment in my language classroom that I think, I don't know, 3-4 years into my teaching career, that if you could record every sentence we spoke in a year in my language class, that like 3/4 of them would be first person sentences. Because we spent a lot of time in language class practicing how to say, this is my name, this is my brother, this is my sister, this is my house, these are my hobbies, this is my favorite book, this is my favorite movie, I like this food, I don't like this food, I like this subject area, I don't like this subject area, I went on vacation here, I did this on the beach. And like, this is how we would learn languages. And it was either introducing yourself, or it was all these dialogues about, can I have a train ticket to Hamburg? Can I have a steak and fries? My towels need changing in my room, or whatever it is. And again, with this sort of, initial Christian formation that was going on, I'm starting to realize when a Christian identity is not about self first, right? It's about love of neighbor. It's about considering others better than yourselves. And it just suddenly hit me that we spent a lot of time in language class learning to talk about ourselves and ask other people to give us things. I thought my language classroom is structurally egocentric, and adding a Bible verse would not change that. Praying at the start of class would not change that, because it's in the structure of what we practice across time when we're doing supermarket dialogues and train station dialogues and so on. So starting to try to unpick that, then became a project for the next 10 years of like, but how do I turn this inside out? And we actually focus on learning languages as an act of hospitality, and learning to listen to other people, and learning to care for our neighbor through the way we speak and listen. And in a sense, that's got nothing to do with whether I teach in a public school or a Christian school. I mean, there are differences, right? But if I'm going to have integrity as a Christian teacher, I have to figure out how I'm going to live with the teaching process wherever I teach.
I feel like the example you gave right there, it makes so much sense when I hear you say it, but thinking about that and coming up with that and kind of going against what is provided in the curriculum or what is kind of expected for a language learning classroom takes a lot of initiative. And you said the word intentionality there too.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, maybe just, do you have another example of where you've seen this work in a totally different type of classroom where you've seen this kind of thinking, just as a model for, getting people thinking about that?
Yeah, so, lots of them. Which one should we pick? Let's go sciences. A couple of colleagues of mine at Calvin University, Rachel Baker and Amy Wolsterman, have had this neat project going on for several years where they got interested in, there's a recent new discipline called the science of team science, which is basically about how scientists collaborate. Because outside of Spider-Man movies, science is not done by like lone scientists in basements with lots of bubbling test tubes. The average working scientist has more than 13 collaborators. And often those collaborators are in different locations, they're from different cultures, they're male and female, one of them is a chemist and one's a biologist, and they learned different terminology for what they're doing. And so there's all these barriers to collaborating well. And so Rachel and Amy sort of started thinking about, Christians have been trying to figure out how to live together in intentional community for thousands of years.
Mm,
Maybe there's some wisdom here that could come out of that.
mm,
So they went and did interviews with intentional Christian communities and basically asked them, what practices do you use to avoid killing each other while being in close proximity over time? And they then kind of operationalized these for the science lab. So they brought this to the science classroom. So, for example, they will introduce to their students the practice of intentional humility.
mm,
They'll say, what does this look like in terms of science lab behaviors? Well, it might mean that if you don't understand something, instead of sitting with a really smart expression on your face and hoping that somebody else will actually ask a question, you put your hand up and you say, I don't understand this. I need you to explain it to me. It means if you make a mistake, you don't sort of have a quick look around and see if anybody noticed and see if you can clear it away with that. You admit that you made a mistake, right? So it means you ask for help when you need it. It means when somebody else asks for an explanation, you don't roll your eyes because it's slowing you down because you already understand that, right? So this is broken down into some practices, and then ask the students to choose one of these and practice it consistently for a week. So, like at least once a day in one of my classes, I'm going to put my hand up and ask a question about something I don't understand. And then they debrief it with the students, and they have students journaling about it. They've got some really fascinating student journaling stuff coming out of this, where they're finding that it enhances the science learning because it turns out that if you ask more questions, you actually learn more. But it's also getting students thinking about how humility and the way they relate to the people around them are relevant to the practice of science. And of course, also the space in there for thinking about how that relates to being Christian. So again, it's this kind of, it's not stopping the science class to do a Bible study.
Right.
It's figuring out how the dynamics of the science class might nest into, a Christian way of understanding how we live together.
Yeah, that's great. I could keep going on this train of thought. I'm sure you could too.
Oh, it's
Just
dangerous. I could go for days.
yeah, it's so transformational thinking about how that impacts the learning. Like you said, it's still the same content, but it's the how you approach it and how we learn together. I'm all about concrete. You mentioned concrete. I'm all about the practical around here. So, in the book, Everyday Christian Teaching, you walk through different themes, essentially different areas where these principles play out in a classroom, and then you actually provide the practical exercises to make that actionable. So I love that there's something to do as these big topics are introduced. um, I'm curious, I'm intrigued by the topics themselves. You have beginning and ending, and then you have 5 other themes in between: connecting, framing, assigning, pausing, and repeating. So maybe we can work through a few of these just
Mm-hmm.
to give kind of some bigger picture framework for some of these examples that you have of how this plays out. So to start, can you talk about how the practice of intentional prayer, you mentioned not just doing a Bible study or starting class with prayer, how can intentional prayer impact classroom environment, maybe right at the start of the year?
Well, something I try to do at the start of the year is a couple of weeks before the semester starts to get the class list. And we use a Moodle system online, so I can also pull photos of most of the students. And I kind of turn them into a bookmark and stick it in my Bible or something I'm reading at the time, and start praying for the students before the semester starts. And then along with that, I also arrange depending how many students I have, a 5 or 10 minute one-on-one meeting with every student in the first few days of the semester. And it totally destroys my first week. I do nothing else in my free time than just meet with sequences of students. But what I found that does to me is that, you know, like I think most other human beings, I've got an undercurrent of anxiety at the start of a school year. There's a whole new set of students. I haven't met them before. There's part of me deep down thinks it's not going to work this year, that however well it went last year, this is going to be the group of students that finally figure out I'm a fraud. And or that I'm too old or whatever. And I start getting the teacher dreams just before the semester starts, where you're trying to teach a class that's not listening to you, or you're trying to find the classroom where your class is, or whatever. Um, so I find that when I put this time into praying for students and meeting with students before we get going, they become human beings to me much quicker. Whereas if I don't do that, I walk into a room of like 20 people and I'm in charge. I've got to make things happen. I've got to organize stuff. And it takes weeks longer for them to fully become people for me. And part of my teaching behavior is driven by this slight underlying anxiety about how it's going and how I'm performing and did they get what I just said and so on. Whereas if I can work on making them people to myself, making them neighbors to me as quickly as possible, I can relax into it much quicker and just communicate with them like human beings, which seems like a weird thing to say, but it terrified me. My I think my second year in teaching, we were doing speaking exams at the end of the school year for French, and so kids were coming one by one to have their exam recorded, and we're sitting there, and I remember this one kid sitting opposite him, not that great at French, just watching him struggle to produce these sentences with this really complicated expression on his face, with a sort of a mixture of concentration and fear and exasperation and so on. And I just sat there thinking, I've never seen this kid before. He's been in my class for a year. Like, I could name him, I could pick him out of a crowd, but you know how you sit opposite somebody in a restaurant and you see who they are differently from if you see them on a bus, or I thought I've taught this kid for a year and I'm not sure I've ever really seen him until this moment. So I thought I've got to change that. I've got to find ways of seeing my students as soon as possible, and I find that prayer can be an important part of that at the start of the school year.
It's that idea of seeing the students in front of us is so key to creating a sense of classroom community too,
Hmm.
and knowing the people, the individuals, and how they function together as a group as well. Can you talk more about how you imagine a classroom community to look like, maybe beyond I love celebrating a birthday, but beyond celebrating birthdays or just having students turn and talk, what's at the heart of classroom community?
Well, part of the challenge here is that community means a lot of different things, right? And
Mm.
and one of the things it means for modern North Americans is, so I'm not going to speak for every other culture, but the context in which I teach, one of the things community means is hanging out with and being nice to people you get along with. Right, it's like community is like, having burgers on the deck, or going out to a sports game, or celebrating the birthdays, etc. So if you translate that idea of community in the classroom, then community becomes mostly about, do we get along with each other? Do we celebrate things together? Do we tell stories every now and then? And that's not wrong. I'm not against that, but that's not really primarily what the New Testament's talking about when it talks about community. So, and we could easily spend an hour on some theological sources on this right now, but in a nutshell, there's this strand in the New Testament where community is actually about learning to sacrificially support people you didn't choose. Right? It's about becoming part of this body where the other people in this body are not like you. Right? They're Jews and Gentiles and slaves and free and Scythians and all the rest of it. Right? And there's evidence from the start of Acts of them not getting along with each other. Right? The whole dispute about the Hebrew and the Greek widows and so on. So there's this part of this big challenge is trying to create this community that's not built out of friendship groups, and it's not built out of ethnic groups, and it's not built out of people who share the same politics, or the same economic position, right? So it's not the kind of communities where we hang out with people who we get along with. It's all these people, the only thing they share is that they encountered Christ. Other than that, they're coming from different walks of life and different viewpoints and different scenarios. And it's like, how do you put that together? So, Paul talks then all these images of the body and the temple. At one point in First Corinthians, I want to say 11, Paul talks about the parts of the body having equal concern for one another. Right? So building this sense of community where we are each invested in each other's well-being, regardless of whether we like each other, regardless of whether we voted the same way, regardless of whether we look the same. So I don't think the whole sort of sharing birthdays kind of thing quite gets at that. So I've been trying, especially the last few years, to push harder into that. So one thing I've been doing for a few years now, for example, is in about the second week of the semester, I put my students in groups of 4, and I tell them, these 3 other people in your group are the 3 people for whose well-being you are responsible for the rest of the semester. I don't care whether or not they're your friends. I didn't choose the groups on that basis. In fact, I tried to split you up so you're with people who you don't normally hang out with. But I wanted to talk about specific ways you can commit to supporting the learning of these 3 other people this semester, because you can't, it's hard to look after 20 people, but 3 people, you can do that. So we talk about really concrete ways of living that out. Like, if one of your group doesn't show up to class, who's the first to notice? Who's the first to contact them? Who's the first to get a good set of notes for them? Who welcomes them back? When it's February and it's Michigan and we haven't seen the sun for a month, who texts people early in the morning and says, hey, we can do this, I'll see you in class? Who brings some chocolate to class to share, right? So just small, non-heroic things that might actually happen. And then we work at sustaining that through the semester, partly just as a way of saying, it's not just you and your grade, right? It's not just you and the teacher. And I'm finding, as I work with teachers about this, we often think about the teacher's relationship with the students, and we care whether the students get along with each other, but it's more rare to invest intentionally in students learning to support one another outside of affinity groupings.
Yeah, that idea of having everything in common, air quotes here, which is from scripture, isn't
Yeah.
because we think the same way or have the same background, but that we are sharing together, we are supporting one another. I love that picture of the classroom. That's
Right.
great.
If it's not difficult, then we're probably not working with the
Yeah.
right definition of community.
Yeah. 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 That's good.
So,
Let's take a short break to hear about what is behind the heart of Teach Beyond.
There are places in the world where you can't go in as a missionary, but you can go in as a teacher. The beauty of education as missions is the open door it gives to share the gospel. The classroom can become a place to demonstrate the gospel as teachers teach with integrity and live a life honoring to God. The call to education as mission can be both radical and simple. Every teacher and staff member has a unique opportunity to shape lives and show Christ through everyday faithfulness. That's powerful, and it's desperately needed.
For our weekly spotlight, we are focusing on Santa Cruz Christian Learning Center in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. If you want to learn more about opportunities to serve, visit teachbeyond.org/go.
Now, back to our conversation with David. I love how all your examples, they've been so broad. They've used different classrooms, different subjects. You haven't just been like, here's how you teach the Bible well.
Yeah, yeah.
So as we think about that, sometimes it's hard to imagine how faith can fit into different things, which you've covered, but you've also used the idea of framing to help teachers of different subjects practically consider how to do that. So what do you mean when you say framing?
framing is about how we name things. It's about how you tell students what you're doing. Another colleague of mine, Victor Norman, teaches computer science, intro to computer programming. Right, you can't put Bible verses in your computer code; it won't run. But he puts in his syllabus at the start of the semester that there's going to be credit in the course for hospitable coding.
Huh.
And he says that's intentionally there so that the students have no idea what he's talking about and ask him what it means. And so he talks to them about how, again, the way computer coding works, 99% of the time is you don't get to write the whole computer program unless it's some tiny little app. You get to write chunks of code that become part of a much larger body of code. And so the code you write is always passing to the next person and is part of a chain of operations. So the degree to which you are careful when you write your code to comment it clearly and explain what's happening, to note the cases you found where it doesn't work, the exceptions, these kinds of things that are part of good coding, that actually affects the well-being of the next person who gets your code. If you don't do that properly, you're stealing part of their weekend because they're going to have to put in an extra 3 hours figuring out your code and fixing it before they can build it into their code. So in other words, the way you code is directly related to love of neighbor, and it's directly related to hospitality to the person who comes after you, right? Trying to make your code a space that they can work in. And now what sort of fascinated me about this was that he could make all of those same points and only use the language of professionalism. Right? He could say, okay, you're training to be computer programmers. You just need to be good professionals. Good professionals comment their code. They note exception cases, and so on. So those are two different frames, right? And from that, students are going to get two different stories. And the one story is, I just need to learn to be a good professional, but there's no hint in there that that has anything to do with your faith or your personal ethics or your relationships with other people. It's just like this, I'm going into business, I've got to do it right. Whereas the hospitality thing, it makes the same points, but it has these strands that connect back to that part of my imagination that deals with faith and ethics and that kind of thing. So this choice of frame, sort of how do we name what we're doing, is part of how we tell stories to ourselves about what kind of thing we're doing right now. It might be the same thing that we're doing, but it's just it just steers us towards a certain vision for why we're doing it. Etienne Wenger, who's got a book called Communities of Practice, education theorist, he tells this little story. He says, you're walking down the street, you see two stonecutters carving a block of stone into a perfect cube, and you ask them both what they're doing. And the first one says, well, I'm cutting this stone into a perfectly square shape. And the second one says, well, I'm helping to build a cathedral. And he says at the level of skill with the chisel, they're doing the same thing, but at the level of the story they're telling themselves about what they're doing, they're living in very different worlds. So framing is about being conscious about that. What story am I providing for my students about what it is they're doing right now? And I often ask teachers, if I could parachute into your classroom at a random moment in the semester and ask one of your students, what are you doing right now? What kind of story would they tell me? Would they be able to even articulate one? Or is it just like, I don't know, the teacher told me to do this for the next 10 minutes?
What a good provocative thought there of what it looks like when you're in the moment. Can we articulate why we're doing this, what we're doing? And I think that comes up a lot also with assigning work, and that's something we do a lot in the classroom. To some extent, it's part of how we learn because we need to have individual application of the content and all of that. But how does actually assigning work to students relate to being Christian?
Well, first, it's just about being intentional about what happens when we assign work. So, in the book, I talk about some research we did as part of the Digital Life Together project, which is a previous book a team of us worked on, where we were interviewing students about the use of digital technology. And these two students talked about what happens when the teachers give them homework. They said, well, most teachers, they just say, here's your reading assignment. And then what we do is we go look up the answers using the search function on the computer, and we fill out the worksheet and we turn it in. But this one teacher emphasized to us that he really wanted us to slow down and read carefully. And so we did that. We took notes. And like the difference was just how explicit the teacher was being about how he wanted the students to do the task. And I think most of us, when we're giving out things like homework, it's not our most thoughtful moment in the day, right? Sometimes it's the end of class, we timed it wrong. Students are putting books in their bags. And it's like, remember, by tomorrow, chapter 2 by
Right.
tomorrow, right? Get to page 27, answer the first 3 questions, and they're on the way out of the room. And one of the things that students learn from that in schools is a task completion mentality, because sometimes the most frequent instruction they hear from teachers is read to page 27, answer 10 questions, get it done by tomorrow, turn it in at 9 o'clock, read chapter 3, write 400 words, right? It's all this quantitative instruction. And what students take away from that is that what the teacher cares about most deep down is just getting stuff done. Not actually whether they're learning or growing or changing, but just getting stuff turned in. That's really what the teacher cares about. And then if I can use my computer to get it done quicker by like searching for the answer online instead of reading the essay, why wouldn't I do that? Because all the teacher cares about is that I answer 10 questions and get it turned in by tomorrow. And students were articulating that to us in focus groups. So imagine instead if I intentionally gave myself 3 or 4 minutes at the end of class and said to students, right, by tomorrow, we're going to be reading chapter 2. And you're going to notice when you get about 3 pages into chapter 2, you're going to get to this page where it gets a little dense, right? There's some big ideas right there on about 3 pages in. You'll see it. And when you get to that page, I need you to slow right down. Read that page twice. In fact, 3 times would be awesome. And in fact, what would be even better would be when you've read it 3 times, go find a friend and read that page aloud to them and see what they think it means. Because there's some really important ideas in there that are actually quite important for our growth and how we think about this together. And we're going to work on this together in class tomorrow. Even if that means you don't quite get to the end of the chapter, I would rather that than that you don't spend time trying to figure out what these paragraphs have to do with how you think about this stuff. That's I'm making this up as I go along, right? But that's a very different set of messages. So to me, the assignments thing is about trying to be intentional about how is it I actually want my students to grow intellectually, morally, spiritually, socially through the task that I'm giving them. Because if the only point of the task is for them to fill out 10 questions on a worksheet, then don't do it. That's find something more worthwhile to do. So it forces me as a teacher to think about the impact I might be having on students through the assignments that I create and to articulate that to myself. And I think it's a good discipline at least once a week to get explicit about that and be asking myself, what is my vision for how students grow? And to be able to articulate that to them.
David, I'm thinking about like the math problems, math worksheet example
Right.
here. Ultimately, the goal is for a student to become more confident in doing math
Right.
facts, right?
Right.
So walk me through how assigning the math worksheet or assigning the page in the math book, for example, might
Right.
be reoriented is it just articulating, hey, we're doing this so we get practice so we can get better and more confident, and it's still the same assignment, or is it assigning a totally different thing?
That's a starting point, and I will say up front, I'm not a math teacher, so
Sure.
don't ask me what the perfect math assignment should be. But imagine this back in the context. So give a context to this. I talked a little earlier about setting up the accountability groups where we're responsible for each other's learning. So imagine if I said, we assign, let's say we assign the math worksheet where we've got to work on, I don't know, long division or whatever it is we're working on. But when I'm setting it up, I say to students, okay, here's the skill we're working on right now. Working through 20 of these is going to help you get used to doing this. So I want you to first go away at home and work through 20 of these. But then when you've done that, like 5 minutes before class, or depending on how your school's set up, I'll give you 5 minutes at the start of class to sit down with your accountability group and just share your answers with each other. And when you do that, don't just see like who got the best score, but actually see if you can figure out why different ones of you got different things wrong and how you can help them think it through. And let's see if by the end of that, we've helped each other make more progress with being able to do this. So again, that's just putting it in a different kind of
Sure.
context in terms
Yeah.
of what else is being built while I learn this. So yeah.
I love that idea, even tying them all together. And this is not a here's one solution, here's another solution. This is a unified idea. As we work through the book and talking through the different themes, two other themes you have are pausing and repeating. And how do these relate to everyday teaching?
Oh, so much to say here. So let me pause for a moment. So pausing is about how we use silence, right? None of us teach the entire semester on one breath. And one of the ways we communicate what's important to us is by what goes fast and what goes slow. So in every teacher's semester, there are things that they slow down and linger over, sometimes unconsciously, right? They stop and tell a story about it, or they pause and show an example, or we take a whole week over this. There are other things that when push comes to shove and there's pressure at the end of the semester, they kind of skip through them, and we get it done in half a class to say that we did it. And students infer from that what we think is actually important about the semester, the things that we give time to, the things that we slow down for, and the things that we speed up and skip over. So one part of the pausing thing is just like, what do we slow down over, right? What do we actually stop and say, what did we just do? And why is this important? That's one part of it. Another part of it is there's research going back to the 1970s on teacher wait time. And again, I don't know what this is like internationally, but in the US, North Americans have this habit of speaking to each other in conversations with zero gaps between their utterances. After 25 years in the Midwest, I still can't get this, right? When I try to jump into conversations, I'm always talking over somebody because I still haven't quite figured out this split second moment where you have to get in and take your turn in the conversation. And of course, North American teachers are also North American human beings. And so when a North American teacher asks a question, the average time that they wait before taking an answer from a student is 1.2 seconds. That means the student has 1.2 seconds to understand the question, think of an answer, put their hand up and start articulating an answer. And what they found was that if they could train teachers to get up to even 3 seconds, which turned out to be hard, you have to be quite conscious about it. They found that more students answered, they gave longer answers, they used better reasoning in their answers. But one of the most intriguing findings to me was that they found that the teacher's estimation of the intelligence of minority students went up. Because if you've got 1.2 seconds, your student who's speaking in their second language is never going to get to answer a question, right? Or your students who's dealing with cultural differences or whatever it is, right? So the teachers started hearing those students give intelligent answers more often and started seeing them as smarter. Now, that's a justice question, right? Are you actually giving opportunity to all of the students in your classroom? And it's actually tied to how you use silence, right? The spaces that you give your students for thinking. So all the way down to these split-second silences in your classrooms, the way you use pauses are part of how you communicate what you value and who you value. And lots more examples we could talk about. There's things in the book about just the value of silent reflection and how we build that in and what that might do for our spiritual formation. I have my students watch a 7-minute video of a snail moving over a rock just to see if they can, and just to work on the way that we've been trained to focus on speed and productivity and filling every moment, which makes us not very good at slowing down and reflecting and seeing what's there. So there's just lots to explore in the pausing area. Repeating is a similar kind of thing in a way. It's again about, we used to the idea, for instance, that we repeat math skills, right? We do lots and lots and lots of addition problems until we've got it. And we repeat stuff at the gym. But sometimes our big ideas, like our thoughts about, I don't know, our spiritual development or whatever, we kind of give a devotion once and then we move on and that text never comes back. So what are students gleaning from the things that recur through the semester? Could we, for instance, take find a paragraph that expresses our vision for where we're trying to get to for the semester, and revisit it every 2 weeks and see if we've made any progress yet, and see if it reads differently now that we've done 2 weeks more thinking, and make this a conversation that we have across the entire semester. Or could we use repetition as a way of getting more intimately connected to something? Like, I know at least 2 local teachers that do a project where students have to adopt a square meter of the world, and they have to go visit it once a month for a year. And every month they have to go do a detailed observation of like what sights, sounds, smells are there, what's living there, what creatures do they see, what noises are there, who's using the space, what's growing, etc. And they have to try to get to know 1 square meter of the world really well. And part of the thought behind that is, we talk about things like creation care in a lot of Christian schools. You can't do creation care if you're always driving past the world at 45 miles an hour. You just can't. Right? If the world's a blur in your background as you move through it at speed, you cannot care for it well unless you slow down and see what's there. So repetition can be a way of forcing us to get past the, okay, I get it, it's in my notes, I move on, and actually slow down and re-engage and try to care about something, rather than just like filing the notes and moving on because I got my grade. So much more to say about both of those, but I'll stop
and
there.
that's a good actually principle for thinking about our classes too, I think, because we can't pause and repeat everything. It's a
Right.
choice, actually, what you're going to emphasize or leave out, or whatever it is, to be able to create that space for pausing and for repeating certain things. And so we have to choose, knowing that that's sometimes a difficult choice to make, right? But I think it's such a helpful practice in thinking about how we approach the content.
Yeah, there's a sense in which all of these strategies are, one of the things they are is ways of trying to force you to think about what's actually important.
Yeah, that's good.
You're right. Where all of these things we could spend a long time on. For instance, the pausing one, as a Midwesterner, I feel very called out because I've worked on longer pauses in my meetings with teams, and I can feel the pain in myself as I just wait, and I'm like, okay, I think I did long enough, and I'm sure I never do.
Yeah.
I do also love what you mentioned about repeating, and it kind of reminds me of liturgy, where you say the same thing each time, but it means something different as you do it over the years. So that's really helpful. As we talk about how we do this in a classroom, there's also classroom schools where you're not allowed to openly express your faith in the classroom. So a lot of things you've shared, you can still do. But do you have any advice for people in that situation? How have you seen people best live that out in those classrooms?
Yeah, this one's sort of fascinating. First, I would say talk yourself out of the idea that your faith is primarily your words about faith. Right? The talking about Christianity is not the same thing as Christianity. So, and if you of course, I don't believe that, right? But if you think that the only time you get to be Christian is when you stand up and say something Christian, when you get to quote a Bible verse or say a prayer or say something controversial in science class or whatever, like that's not a good picture of getting to be Christian. So you sent me the questions ahead of time, and I really paused over that phrase where you don't get to openly express your faith. Like, if I go into my classroom and I set up these accountability groups and I really emphasize mutual care and that every human being here counts, and you're going to care for this other person's learning regardless of whether you think they're your friend or and so on. And I do that because I've been reading what Paul says about the parts of the body having mutual concern for each other and love of neighbor and so on. Is that openly expressing my faith, or do I have to quote a Bible verse as well for it to be openly expressing my faith, right? So, I mean, I feel like I've been living with this for long enough that it's almost weird to me to think that openly expressing my faith would have to mean like standing up and saying something, right? Or having a Bible verse T-shirt on or something. That to me feels a little weird at this point. Now, it's not that the words aren't important, right? At some point, you have to give an account for right, but this whole give an account for the hope that's in you, that sort of presupposes that somebody noticed the hope within you without the account, right? That you have to then give the account at some point, right? So yeah, at some point there are opportunities when, to explain like why you do what you do, but that's not an everyday class thing. The point is not to replace math class with Bible class. This is all about the way you teach the math class communicates what you think is valuable. It communicates what you think human beings are. It communicates how you think they're supposed to grow. It communicates how you think they're supposed to relate to each other while they're learning. It communicates what you think the purpose of schooling is and what you think they're going to do later in life. And most of that is communicated through the way that you do things, not through the religious statement that you bring in partway through. And there's lots and lots of scope for getting more intentional about that without hitting the crisis point where you feel like you've got to name the Bible verse or something. So I just feel like there's a lot of room to explore before you get to the difficulty. It's not that the difficulty is not there, right? There's a point where you're like, at some point, when can I say why? I get that, but if you feel like that's the be all and end all, then I feel like you're sort of missing 95% of the iceberg in terms of what's going on. Like I said, I taught in public schools for my first 6 years, and that's where I started working on all this stuff. And I'm not sure that any of the examples that I've given so far, I couldn't have done in that context.
Yeah. I also, the idea of there's so many places to go without, there's the barrier, like the wall that you can't kind of cross. But if that's all you're focused on, and that like stops you from doing all the other stuff, you're missing lots of opportunities. In Teach Beyond, we talk about education opening doors of opportunity for both the student as we think about what their future might hold after they've gained education, but also in the conversations we can have now in the classroom when we're with the student. How have you seen that play out with your students and in classrooms?
We often fall into habits here that I don't think work well. They're the kind of, well, you have to learn this because it's going to be on the exam, or you have to learn this so you can get a job, right? And there's a guy from the 17th century that I work on. I'm writing a couple of books about him at the moment called Comenius. He was a bishop and an educational thinker. And he has this, he talks in quite direct terms about how all education's got to be practical. You should never teach anything that's not practical. And I think that's often been misunderstood more recently as being, well, it should all be about like balancing your checkbook or whatever. For him, practical means it helps you live in the world wisely. And living in the world wisely means you need to know how to relate to God. You need to know how to treat other creatures well. You need to know how to relate to other human beings ethically. Yes, you need skills and you need to be able to make a living and so on. But all of that is your future, right? Your future is not just like which job you get or which university you get into or whether you pass this exam. So I think for me, a lot of this is trying to steer those conversations with students towards, not negating what skills are you gaining, right? That's, I'm not setting that aside for a moment, but also what human being are you becoming? Who are you going to be in 5 years? And how is what we're doing here contributing to who you're going to be in 5 years? And what that opens up in individual conversations with students is things like, again, I hope it's not too much of a tangent, but it just springs to mind talking about this. This whole community thing. Another practice I've been trying out with my students for a few years is I give them a homework for a week, which is you have to go find a person you see every day. And if possible, someone you don't like, someone who's a little irritating, someone you would not choose to hang out with at the weekend. And all I want you to do is every time you see them this week, use it as a mental trigger and pause and offer thanks for their life in whatever way you find appropriate. And that's it. You may not pray that they will change. That's cheating. So we do that for a week, and then I have students journal about this. And again, different students have different experiences. There are no magic bullets, right? But a significant subset of students start realizing that in just 1 week of practicing active thankfulness for the people around them, their attitude to those people starts to change. They start to get less annoyed by them. They start to tolerate them as human beings. So I had one student at the end of the last semester, who in her final, reflections sort of said, this is a practice I'm carrying forward into my other relationships. I've already started doing this with 2 or 3 other people in my life. And I want to carry this forward as a skill that I'm going to need when I work in a school, because I'm going to work with colleagues that I don't like. I'm going to have students who really annoy me. And so this is a really important thing for me to carry forward. And again, it was just one of those moments where I think, how often do we think of that kind of thing as a skill that students need when they graduate, right? The ability to use thankfulness to get along with annoying people rather than being able to pass item 7 on the math curriculum or whatever. And yet it's a really important real life skill for the occupation that she's going to go into, right? If you're going to be a teacher and you can't get along with annoying people, you're not going to last long. So it's that kind of just sort of broadening the picture of what future means and what goals mean and kind of where we're trying to get to and trying to articulate that to each other.
Yeah, it matters now and it matters for the future, right? I
Right,
think there's that
right.
element of it's not just for some future thing, but also about your formation now. And there's that kind of
And
two-part growth.
yeah, creating that experiential assignment around it where we don't just talk about it or do a reading about it, but we actually go try it for a week creates
Hmm.
this moment of discovery about myself right now,
Yeah.
where I'm at, how I am reacting to people, what might need to change. So yeah, that's an important part of it too, is trying to find a pedagogical way of making it feel
Hmm.
relevant now in a way that's future pointing by getting to work on ourselves a little bit. That
Yeah.
assignment changed how I thought about homework when I first did
Mm.
it. Homework doesn't have to be read something, write something, research something. There's lots of things you can get students to go experiment with.
Well, you've certainly given us so many different layers of the practice of teaching to be thinking about, reflecting on. I'm sure it's stimulating different ideas and questions as we're thinking through this. So, if we could just boil it down to one small shift that a teacher could make tomorrow or this semester to put some of this into practice, what would be those actionable tips or suggestions that you would have?
Um, yeah, I always struggle with the one thing because partly because of what you said earlier. I think it's a complex of things that fit together, but you're right. You do have to start somewhere. So, so here's a couple to choose from. One would be take a look at one class that you teach and ask yourself which of my assignments during this class um, actively and explicitly teach students how to care for one another while they're doing the work. Um, and just change one assignment so that it's got that prompt in it, right? So there's thing we talked about earlier, but it's an easy thing to start doing. Just sort of start with like, is this a thing that's in my class at all, right? Do I treat my students like they actually need to look after each other? I find that elementary school teachers are already better at that than secondary school teachers are. Secondary school teachers tend to treat students like pods. Um, or another one would be choose the student in your class who you think is finding it most difficult to learn in your class and take them out for coffee and find out what their experience of the class is and see if they can give you any help on things you might change in your class. Um, or ask yourself, what pictures do my students see on the screen during the semester and what vision is that giving them about who human beings are? Is there anything on? So it's these really concrete kind of, specific kind of things. I think you're right. Change everything is not an easy place to start, but start with one thing. Yeah.
And, you've talked about community and caring for one another. And I would just throw in the challenge too that if you're listening to this in isolation and trying to figure it out alone, maybe pull in another teacher,
Yeah.
whether they're at your school or around the world, to dialogue with and try this out because I can imagine I'm putting myself back into the classroom and thinking I would need someone else to be trying this too and say
Yeah.
what's working and can you help me look at my lesson plans and my slides and whatever it is to be able to help each other. So um, man, so many great thoughts, great examples. Thank you so much for giving us food for thought and also how it could look to imagine what our classrooms could look like as we are just living out our faith authentically and caring about the people in front of us.
Yes, we thank you so much for joining us. We have one final question before we let you go. So we're at the end, but this is the big one. We always ask our guests, what is one thing that's changing your life right now? So this can be something that's really big or something small that is still changing your life. So it can be bigger, small, serious, or not so serious, and that's fine. I'll go first, then Heather, and so you get a little bit of time to think about
Yeah.
it. You're not thrown into it. So it's changing my life and my family's life. Actually, is my sister just got married a little bit ago, so it's been very exciting. Her wedding was great, but now we also have a new brother-in-law, a new uncle for my kids. So
Yeah.
that's been really fun and exciting to celebrate that.
That's great. And I'm sure you got some time with your family around that special event too, which is also really neat when you can come together for something like that. What's changing my life, this is kind of just like a little window into what is fun for Heather, David. So my I live in Pittsburgh. And so the Pittsburgh International Airport has been undergoing construction and renovation for quite a while now. And they are just about ready to open their new terminal, which is really just the departures and arrivals area. The gates are all staying the same. They're getting a glow up, but the departures and arrivals area is totally in a different place. And they opened it up to a public trial. So they had people from all over Pittsburgh come and do like a walkthrough test and then fill out a survey. I love a survey. So it was that was changing my life. It's changing our city. Our airport is physically changing, but it was also just neat to see how involving the community. There's such a sense of excitement and pride amongst the people who were there for the trial, and just fun to be able to participate in that as a community. So that was changing my life lately. What about you, David?
Biggest change for me the last couple of months is I'm on sabbatical right now, and
Oh,
so I'm actually not teaching this semester, or in fact this year,
wow.
and so that's a pretty big change. And the guy I mentioned earlier, Comenius, my 17th century guy, he was just a major Christian thinker about education, and most of his stuff is not available in English. So
Mm,
I'm working on a new set of translations of some of his things, which is forcing me to do very, very slow readings
wow.
of the stuff that he wrote in Czech and Latin. And so I'm just spending a lot of time just reading him closely and slowly and figuring out how to say it in English. And it's just been a real treat to do that kind of really slow engagement, right? To be actually have chance to stop and think about every paragraph, and not be kind of racing through stuff. So I would sort of I would recommend choosing one thing at intervals in your life to read really,
Huh.
really slowly.
Yeah.
Hmm,
Yeah.
that's
That's
amazing.
great. Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation and for the books that you've put out in on these very valuable topics. So thanks for being here today.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thank you for having me.
That was such a great conversation. I loved how many practical examples he gave us in different stories.
Yes, it was so great to hear. And we want to give away some copies of this book. So head over to social media, Facebook or Instagram, where you can enter to win by tagging a teacher friend. As we were talking about earlier, I love the thought that we learn in community, and this is so key to our professional development. So we want to give you and another teacher this book to work through together.
And whether you win this giveaway or not, you can find David I. Smith at onchristianteaching.com.
And you can share this episode with others in your professional learning community to grow together as you take steps to implement these actionable ideas.
Heather and I serve with Teach Beyond, a mission organization reaching the nations through education.
Want to learn more and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org or follow us on social media.
To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we'd love it if you would leave a rating or review and share the show with a friend. Be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform where you listen so you never miss an episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.